The history of Spain followed a very different path from the rest of Europe. Governed by an aristocracy, army, and the church, modern education, industry, and radical ideas arrived only in the late 19th century. Although Spain played no part in World War I, by the 1930s it faced social and national division and economic hardship. The failure of a military dictator, Miguel Primo de Rivera, during 1923 to 1930, led in 1931 to the flight of King Alfonso XIII and the setting up of a republic. Francisco Franco was a good military commander. His men were loyal. His problem was he was conservative. In 1925, as he rose up in his career, this wasn't a problem. But by 1936, the leftist government was in charge. He was mostly stationed in Spanish Morocco, but he was also commander of the military academy at Saragossa. He led the Generals' Rising, which started the Civil War, along with General Mola and Goded. During the Civil War, he emerged as the natural leader. He later became dictator of Spain until his death in 1975. So here's a chart of the different political parties, starting with our furthest from the left, or their furthest to the left, which is our anarchists, who wanted radical social reform. Burn it down is what they thought. Then you get your center-left socialists that wanted social reforms to achieve greater fairness and distribution of wealth. Nothing radical, of course, but not too radical, as we're going to see is with the anarchists. Then you get the center, and they wanted moderate reforms. They thought, in time, but they moved increasingly right as our center-left took over. Our center-right defended the social hierarchy and religion, and they had commitments to democracy, kind of, maybe, not really. We get our right. These are our fascists, and even these will become even further to the right here under Franco. And then our separatist party, both Catalonian and Basque, they did not work together, rather worked for their own rights. And then Carlism, Wikipedia that. It is so fascinating. It's still an issue in Spain today. And this is traditionalists that sought a different heir to the Bourbon dynasty in 1831. They argued for Salic law in which no woman could inherit. And instead, what happened was a woman did inherit. And they've been fighting their claim ever since. The new republic rose up after 1931 when the king stepped down. It faced many problems. First of all, it was the early days of the Great Depression, which was causing social upheaval everywhere. Also, they began to attack the three main and oldest traditions in Spain, and that was the church, the army, and the landowners. There was falling agricultural prices, which made peasants upset. There was declining exports, which hit the middle class. There was also rising peasant unemployment. In the cities, there was also unemployment because of the falling prices for iron and other such things. Left-wing parties, as a result, were prized to take over, and they wanted a social revolution, but they couldn't agree on how to do it. Some wanted to overthrow the republic even. Syndicalists then, therefore, encouraged riots, strikes, and even assassinations. Also at this time, the Basque region in the north was seeking self-determination, as was the Catalonian region in Spain, which lies to the east. Azuna and Zamora were now in power. They traded off the presidency and the office of the prime minister. Many things were still very problematic, and right away they attacked the Catholic Church, which was going to be very unpopular with the lower classes. The church and state were separated for the first time in Spain. Jesuits were even expelled from the country, and education was no longer in the hands of the church. Also, they attacked the army, which had traditionally overthrown governments, and really you could not rule Spain without the army. And as a result of that, they're going to lose a lot of the high officer support for the left. They tried universal conscription as a way to kind of force the lower classes or even a lot of the Republicans to join the military so they could weed it out. But that's going to turn against them later. They also attacked the landowners and passed the Agrarian Reform Bill of 1932. Tenants were afforded some protection and they had workers' rights for the first time. And then they gave Catalonia some self-determination. They even tried to institute workers' wages and minimum days in industries. There was opposition to reforms, and surprisingly, there was a lot of opposition from the peasant class in Spain, which was a very large class in Spain. They centered around one of the generals, Sanjurjo, and as a result, many of the peasants are going to be executed by the Republican government. They really were monarchists. Some were right-wing Republicans, some were Africanistas, which was the army of Spain in Morocco. Also at this time, a new right-wing party rose up called the CEDA, led by Gil Robles. It leaned towards an Italian-style corporate state. Also, there was another party, a fascist party on the Italian model called the Falange, and it was founded by Jose Antonio Primo de Vera, who was the son of the former dictator of the 1920s. They were traditionalists and really kind of clashed with this new idea. They repudiated the Republican Constitution and party policies. They didn't like capitalism or even clericalism. They sought a strong government and national glory and Spanish imperialist expansion. So they were similar to Germany, Italy, and Japan at the same time. And also they wanted like an idea of the state along the corporate lines and the redistribution of land, surprisingly. Despite parades and strict proclamations, the Falange made little headway in its first 3 years. It appealed mostly to students from wealthy families. An election in November 1933 saw a right-wing majority. The biggest party, the CEDA, became the new leaders of Spain. The new government also failed to address the problems of Spain. They did away with many of the reforms of the government before them, even the popular ones, but they also did get rid of the restrictions on the activity of the church and landowners. It also interfered with Catalonian self-government, and it refused to give any support to the Basque. The Basque region had been big supporters of the CEDA, but they switched to the left as a result. Resistance grew among anarchists in Catalonia, and even in the north, a general strike was held. I mean, remember, this is the Great Depression. The miners in the Asturias revolted and captured Oviedo, which was a major city. This was suppressed, actually, by General Franco, who we're going to meet later on, or actually in just a couple of slides. Anyways, Franco's going to brutally attack it. I mean, Franco's position in everything he does is going to be the use of torture and violence and fear. He was known for hanging people publicly, leaving their bodies up, anything he could do. Over 30,000 people were going to be imprisoned, and many died or either starved. It was a terrible situation. And then as this continued, the economic situation in Spain continued to get worse and worse. This is a clear example of one of the problems that the left had in Spain and elsewhere also, and that is they just had too wide of a difference in ideology. I mean, you had liberals who were center, then you had all the way to the anarchists, the communists, and then just socialists who were somewhere between the center and the anarchists, and none of them could decide on anything. So in 1935, they have a meeting of the Comintern, the communists do, where they kind of convince all the leftist parties to form a coalition because of the rising, influence of the Falange. And so they did. They created the Popular Front, and it was actually victorious in the 1936 election. Spain again turned to the left, and the Popular Front is now in charge of the government. This new government of 1936 still had major problems within its own party, first of all, and also the Great Depression is still affecting Spain. It turned out to be a pretty ineffective government since many would not join it, especially on the side of the left, because they were hoping for a revolution which would overthrow the entire existing social order and that this bourgeoisie government would collapse. Also, the right opposed it as well. Disorder grew, workers began to strike, there was even bombings of churches and monasteries. The army was growing upset over that. Then the Falun Fee actually is going to expand from 5,000 to 500,000 members. So you start to see Spain, divide into these radical left or radical right. Even Gil Robles in the CEDA became more fascist. As for the Socialist Party, which was called the PSOE, Largo Caballero, who was in charge, began to call for revolution, but nobody was listening to him at this point. A conspiracy among the army officers began to develop. Azuna was no fool. I mean, he saw this coming. And so one of the things he did was he sought to move all of the officers, these generals, far away from each other, including Franco, who was going to be moved all the way to the Canary Islands, which was the farthest outpost that he could be placed. It was hoped that then they wouldn't be able to communicate or anything like that. But that's not going to be the case. Actually, Franco's going to escape from the Canary Islands and go to Morocco, where he's then going to go to Hitler and Mussolini and get help getting the army over to Spain. But they begin to plot and plan this coup, and word gets out. And it's going to be a failure at first, but it does start a civil war. It didn't stop General Mola from continuing to plot. They also had plans to put somebody else in charge. The pretext, though, was required, and that was going to be the assassination of a well-known monarchist politician named Calvo Sotelo. And this was going to happen on July 12th. Mola set the date a couple of days later for the uprising. This failure, though, to immediately take all of Spain, especially Madrid and Barcelona, is going to lead to a very long civil war. So here's a map of Spain right after Franco and the Africanistas invade. You can see they got some key areas. The Nationalists are territory right here. I mean, this is a very important region for mining. They have access to the sea right here, but yet they fail to take the capital and the industrial heartland, which is right here. So they do not, so initially this is not really successful. This is actually not successful at all, but here too, they managed to get some gains, and this is where all the food supplies are. So there we go. Spain was a very divided country moving into the Civil War. You had those that wanted to preserve that traditional old school mentality and those that wanted to replace it. And the ones that wanted to replace it were very divided. Some wanted self-government like the Catalonians and the Basque. Others wanted a complete social revolution. There was ideological clashes and very little understanding of what actual liberal democracy was. And that was what the government was, and it was only supported by a small minority of the middle class. The majority of the people of the country were against the republic. They didn't like the fact that the church was being attacked. The church also wanted to retain its privileges. The army feared its loss as a special, high class in the government, and they also feared social revolution. So many people turned right, others turned left. You had people that wanted monarchists back. You had capitalists who feared the loss of their privileges, landlords as well. You had fascists who wanted a dictatorship. You also had socialists and anarchists. It was just a mess. And again, you had the Catalans and the Basques who wanted self-government or independence. The Republic had to cope with all of this and the Great Depression, and they really failed in all ways. In Spain, there was just no tradition of tolerance, and so ideological battles brewed fiercely, and then the murder of this right-wing politician just set it all afire. The coup actually began prematurely, and it was actually a bumbled attempt until Franco took over. Once Franco assumed the leadership of the revolt, it removed rather quickly. Its aim was to overthrow the republic and to save Spain and make it traditional again, get rid of social revolution, and he would use terror and violence to do that. But unfortunately, it fails. I mean, the coordinated effort of all of the generals, they managed to take Sevilla, but otherwise they do not take Madrid. Also, Catalonia and the Basque region stay loyal. So this is not too successful in the beginning. They do take a large areas. They take parts of the south as we'll see. But in the end, even the Navy and the Air Force are going to stay loyal to the Republic. It's lucky for this failed coup that they had Franco, because once he takes over, it starts to get coordinated and it's going to become a lot more violent. The role of the workers in resisting the nationalist coup is incredibly important. Many resisted it, and first of all, they wanted to resist it by bringing about the revolution and defeating who they saw as rebellious, people. The Communist Party is going to grow in number and influence because it's going to control the supply from the Soviet Union. Even in September 1936, Largo Caballero became the prime minister. He was in charge of the Socialist Party, or the CNT, and it was brought into the government. And as a result, important trade unions were replaced by political parties. Fighting the nationalists was to take precedence over any revolution. This provoked some resentment, especially in Catalonia, and Barcelona is going to revolt, and there's going to actually be a leftist rebellion in May 1937. The communists and the Republicans are going to use this as an excuse to get rid of Caballero, and a government was set up by socialist Juan Negrin. The Republicans hoped at first to get help from France and Great Britain, even the United States, but none of those countries are going to help because they feared a general war, and also because of domestic pressure. I mean, there was a lot of pressure at home to remain peaceful during this time. So during the autumn of 1936, they called a non-intervention committee, and it met in London at the instigation of Britain and France. Its goal was to make sure that this war did not spread to the rest of Europe. There was this fear that these internal divisions could spread and take over and lead to a world war. Roosevelt also imposed a moral embargo on arms sale to both sides. The effect was that the legitimate government really had no help. They could purchase arms only from Mexico. And then the Communist Party becomes controlling of all the weapons from the Soviet Union. Mussolini, on the other hand, is going to send 50,000 volunteers to help the nationalists. He wished to gain influence in the Western Mediterranean and gained a naval base as a result. Hitler was persuaded by one of Franco's friends, General Canaris, to aid the nationalists. Göring used the war to allow his air force to gain experience and to practice tactics. Hitler also needed Spanish iron for his rearmament program. 12,000 men, including the Condor Legion, were sent to Spain. Even Portugal is going to allow nationalists to use it as a base of operations. The USSR sent advisors, food, tanks, aircraft to the government side. The result, though, was that the Republican government had to rely on the wishes of the communists. The Comintern also organized international brigades of volunteers to fight for the government, which included George Orwell from the UK, General Tito from Yugoslavia, and many others. Hitler and Mussolini both supplied aircraft early in the war, and in fact, they're key to why the Africanistas under Franco are able to get to Spain. The Germans also helped, and sometimes even Catholic Irishmen volunteered. The Italians sent ground troops and supplied tanks and artillery. The Western democracies protested at the violations of the embargo, members from the non-intervention committee, but they did nothing, and this aided Franco and the nationalists. The Soviet Union alone responded, but they demanded gold, and this is going to end up bankrupting the Republican government. In February and March of 1937, the Nationalists tried to take Madrid again, and they failed. Also, there was a lot of fighting in Barcelona during this time. Foreseeing a long war, Franco began to use conscription as well. A lot of the Spanish Civil War is conventional warfare that we saw in World War I, that we'll see again in World War II. This is not a guerrilla type of campaign here. You have foreign forces that are aiding the Nationalists. They didn't like the fact that Franco was excessively slow, but he had his reasons. He did not want foreign troops to gain the credit or even any power in Spain. He didn't want his rivals in the Nationalist army to gain that credit either. He also was exterminating any Republican threat he saw. He killed and killed all of his way. So he slowly moved just so he could eliminate Republican forces everywhere he went. General Franco transferred his effort to the north, as you'll see on the next slide, when German planes will bomb Guernica. In Catalonia, anti-clericalism showed itself in looting and burning of churches. This was happening really all over Spain. Also, as it progresses into 1937, Franco wins one of his most important battles with the Battle of Teruel. And he also is able to use, again, that strategy of terror. He did commit one of his strategic errors in a difficult attack on Valencia, but the Republicans, for the most part, were being most successful during this time period. The final nationalist campaign in Catalonia was relatively easy, and Barcelona fell on January 26, 1939. On the Republican side, the question of a continued resistance was supported by the communists and the socialists, but they were still politically divided. On March 7, 1939, a civil war broke out in Madrid between communists and anti-communists. By March 28th, it was easy to attack Madrid. The capital was starving, people were upset, and by April 1st, all resistance was over. Guernica was a provincial Basque town with a population of 7,000. It was of limited military significance, containing an armaments factory and occupying one of the main routes to the north. On April 26, 1937, it was targeted by Italian and German bomber and fighter aircraft. Bombs released 27,000 kilograms of incendiary bombs, while German fighters strafed the roads full of fleeing civilians. Guernica was left devastated. Over 1,500 people were killed, with many more wounded. The bombing of Guernica was one of the first significant examples of the deliberate targeting of primarily civilian area and the devastation that could be wrought by aerial bombs. This destruction was widely exploited in Republican propaganda within Spain and abroad. 3 days after the bombings, nationalist ground troops facing very little resistance captured Guernica. 700,000 people are going to die. Spain is going to remain fractured for a long time, mostly because of Franco's policy of cleaning up. He had many people sent to prison camps, children from Republican families taken away and put with the Catholic Church. Southwest France was flooded with refugees, so was Latin America. Over 500,000 Spaniards are going to go into exile, leaving. Churches, infrastructure is all going to be destroyed. Basque and Catalan rights get suppressed to the point where they're just coming back up today. Trade unions were prohibited, so workers' rights did not occur. Hitler and Mussolini were emboldened by their actions. They used this as a practice of what was to come in World War II, and their cooperation in this civil war led them to become even closer. The Non-Intervention Committee showed the weakness of the League of Nations. Mussolini in Spain allowed Hitler to also carry out his union with Austria. So it was going to complicate European foreign policy as well. Hitler learned to train his pilots for a blitzkrieg attack that he's going to use later. And again, the ineffectiveness of the League of Nations is really apparent. There were several reasons for the nationalist victory. Franco was just more skillful of a general. He could control the various groups and the opposing factions in the right. He was able to unify the church, the landowners, capitalists, all of them. And the diversity was less so. He also had the support of Pope Pius XI, which made for the nationalists to be seen as like crusaders. So Franco was just more skillful. The nationalists also had a unified military leadership. And the divisions on the government side were fatal. Anarchists and communists actually fought each other several times in Barcelona and towards the end in Madrid. The Republican generals were just bad. They worked at cross purposes. They were regional. They just didn't do very good. And also the Republicans had a voluntary army. Instead, the Nationalists commanded the regular army, the land one. Any attempt to impose strong leadership was resisted by rival groups. The communists didn't want anarchists. The liberals didn't want any of them. And then the foreign intervention was just more effective on the nationalist side, particularly with Germany and Italy joining it. The USSR helped, but not much. I mean, they insisted on being paid fully in gold, and they weren't ever fully committed to this war as Germany and Italy was. Historian E. H. Carr called the Civil War a European civil war fought on Spanish territory. The war appeared to be a practice for and a preview of the Second World War. It involved the same lineup: fascism or populist conservatism against liberal democracy and communism. Inside Spain itself, however, the Spanish War was on the nationalist side a crusade to preserve the tradition of Spain, which created during the 1490s, and on the other side a war to destroy Spain of the 1490s and into the 20th century. With the nationalists winning, Spain does not stay divided for long. They go on a policy of just murdering everybody. In the end, this was just a devastating war and a preview of what's to come in World War II.